Few would argue the historic significance and grandeur of the Roman civilization, a society which from the humblest of beginnings grew into a vast republic before assuming the identity of an empire and defining a standard for nearly every great state of the West which would follow. Often forgotten then, relegated to Rome's shadow, are the great empires of the Greeks just to the east, and even more so that of Carthage just to the south. Before Rome had risen to the heights we all know it to have achieved, in the humblest days of its budding imperial destiny, it lay surrounded by contemporaries of near equal or greater capability, all of whom strived for the greatness Rome would one day hold, and any of which could have snatched it away through a mere change of fortune. In the east existed three major powers, all remnants of Alexander the Great's conquests, existing in a delicate power struggle for both dominance and sovereignty over and from one another. Immediately neighboring Roman waters lay Alexander's homeland, the Macedonian kingdom. Geographically the smallest of the main three, Macedonia was still quite a formidable power, bearing a military reputation greater than that of the Roman Republic when the two first began to clash. The Macedonians had in recent years demonstrated increased ambitions as well as aggression toward its neighbors, enough to warrant Roman concern, especially as Macedonia began to feel it had a voice in Roman affairs, attempting to inject itself into the Second Punic War. Prior to this, however, Rome had perhaps instigated the wider conflict with Greece, as it attempted to bring under Roman control the coastal Greek populations of southern Italy, known at the time as Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece. The subsequent war would have made both sides well aware of the other's capabilities, and though Rome's attention remained fixed to the west, the Greeks would not forget this demonstration of Roman strength, something which would earn Rome both a number of allies and enemies alike within the Greek world. Far to the east of Macedonia, occupying the lands of Persia, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia, stood the titanic Seleucid Empire, an ambitious and populous domain which saw its destiny as one of reunification with the other Greek powers for the establishment of a greater Greek empire. The nature of their domain being that it housed a large non-Greek population, stretched widely for an empire of the time, and bordered potential threats on all sides, had left them in a precarious position for much of their existence. Regions broke away, populations rebelled, enemies invaded, but through it all, the Seleucids had managed to recover all they had lost, and nearly restored a sustainable order. That is, until their encounter with Rome. The defeat of Macedonia by Rome in the Second Macedonian War of 200 BC had served as a beacon for the Seleucids, who now saw the European lands of Greece divided and primed for conquest. Rome, understanding the might of so large an empire, spared no expense in preparing its forces against not merely a potential invasion of Greece, but the Italian peninsula as well. The lesser states of Greece, who in the past remained merely friendly with Rome, now threw their support wholly behind them. Even Macedonia had taken Rome's side, fearing total domination by the Seleucids. The result had been a victory for the Roman faction and a crippling of the Eastern Empire in both economy and morale. The Seleucids lost their westernmost lands, were forced to pay a massive debt of reparations to Rome, and as a result, succumbed to uprisings, civil wars, and invasions in the following decades, before ultimately collapsing. Lands which did not fall to the newly established Parthian Empire were annexed by Rome, who might have made of these remnant lands a client kingdom, but saw the Seleucids as too troublesome a culture to let remain. Before going any further, let's take a minute to thank today's sponsor, Blinkist. Now I love to read. I have stacks of books littering my desk, piled under my desk on shelves next to my bed, and I usually go through the things like candy, but with all the time invested in researching these videos, it can be tough to finish a 200, 300, or 400 page book not pertaining to history within a reasonable amount of time. Sometimes I like to pick up something outside my usual history diet, which of course takes time away from research. It's a vicious cycle, and I'm sure with your busy lives a lot of you feel the same and know how this can be. That's where today's sponsor comes in. Blinkist is a convenient learning app that condenses the central information of some 3,000 plus nonfiction books, whose individual content could take you days to read, into digestible 10, 15, or 20-minute segments, both in text and audio form. The app offers a wide variety of best-selling content, contemporary and historic, available to you both online and off. Enjoy and grow your understanding in the fields of entrepreneurship, science, economics, philosophy, history, politics, religion, and much, much more. I decided to check out some books I'd previously read to gauge the quality of these blinks, and I must say I really enjoyed the abridged take on Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, as well as the biography of Alexander the Great by Philip Freeman. It's a little funny, despite seeing this as a good chance to read books outside of my history genre. The first few blinks I listened to were historical in some way or another. Old habits, I guess. If you head down to the description and click our link, the first 100 of you will receive 1 whole week of unlimited access absolutely free, so that you can see for yourself just how useful Blinkist can be. And if you'd like to sign up for a full membership, you'll also receive 25% off of that. I'm sure there's a lot you'd love to learn and read about, but never find you have the time for it. Here's your chance to try something that might just fix that. Now, back to the video. Finally, along the eastern coast of North Africa, we find the Ptolemy Kingdom of Egypt, a land prized for its strategic and commercial value, and during its early years certainly a force on par with its two major Greek rivals. But this stability and prosperity for the Greek Egyptians would soon come to an end. The some 20-year-long rule of Pharaoh Ptolemy IV was marked by continuous decline. The pharaoh is believed to have been little more than a puppet to his mistress's brother, who had seen to the purging of the pharaoh's immediate family, to ensure no one more capable would challenge the pharaoh's position. Eventually, this puppeteer would be forced to face the outrage of the Alexandrian public, while the pharaoh was succeeded by his son, a 5-year-old at the time who alone could not rule, leading to a mass power struggle between his regions. Throughout this period, native Egyptian revolts would plague the kingdom, and eventually result in the fracturing of Egypt by various self-proclaimed pharaohs. Egypt's fall from power had been, inadvertently, destabilizing. The balance of power between the Seleucids, Macedonia, and the Ptolemies had collapsed, terrifying the lesser Greek states who now felt themselves easy prey to the remaining imperial-level Greek powers. Refusing to accept domination by Macedonia or the Seleucids, the lesser states of Greece would turn their eyes to the seemingly sole alternative of Rome, earning the Republic a number of valuable allies that would prove indispensable once it found itself pulled into conflict in the Greek world. Macedonia would fall. The Seleucids, crippled and driven from their rich eastern lands, would also fall. Eventually, Egypt too would fall subject to total conquest by the Romans under Octavian, soon to be Emperor Augustus. To the west of Egypt remained one more rival to Roman power, and the final major piece of this story, a state not of Greek background but rather a Phoenician one, the Empire of Carthage. Perhaps the most famous of the Roman Republic's adversaries, the Carthaginians had been well at the forefront of both naval might and commerce in the West Mediterranean, just as the Republic had been coming to prominence. Carthage thus came to be the prime focus of Rome's attention around the 3rd century BC, as opposed to the Greeks, which comparably were of little interest to Rome, so much so that following the Second Macedonian War, Rome essentially withdrew all its forces from the region, virtually abandoning it. In fact, Rome only seemingly re-engaged itself against the Greeks after discovering the Carthaginian general Hannibal had been directly supporting the Seleucids, and even before this were primarily motivated to initiate conflicts with Macedonia during the Second Punic War, after intercepting a treaty for alliance between Carthage and the Macedonians. This web of alliances and strategies by Carthage is arguably the catalyst behind Rome's shifting of focus from the west to the east, which it would come to discover was far more profitable, albeit much harder to maintain. Despite the continued efforts of Carthage, of Macedonia, and its brief brush with the Seleucids, Rome emerged on top, dominating the lands of all its former adversaries. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, instead of the Romans defeating and conquering the Greeks and Carthaginians, Rome itself was conquered? When looking at a map of what Rome was up against, it's quite impressive to see just the odds they managed to overcome. However, we should also consider that Carthage, while seemingly holding a vast stretch of land, did not maintain a tight hold over much of its inland territories, with perhaps the exception of Iberia, the implications of which served as a major motivator for Rome to combat their expansion there, and delay the establishment of a Carthaginian foothold in mainland Europe. The Carthaginian army also suffered from heavy reliance on diverse mercenaries from its own conquered lands and abroad, as well as an inefficient system of military leadership which tended to result in hesitation, mutiny, disloyalty, and disorganization. It's been famously written by Machiavelli that what distinguished Hannibal as so successful a Carthaginian general is that he was able to prevent this unruly disloyalty by being both respectable yet terrifying to his men, so much so that they dare not disobey him. The Macedonians also suffered from division, both internal and external. The Romans were able to exploit this by gaining the support of lesser Macedonian rivals and utilizing them to preoccupy any armies that would otherwise be directed against Rome in full force. This tactic would be built upon war after war, continually whittling the Macedonians down, whilst providing Rome with more allies, using the weight of the Greek world against itself. The Seleucids alone against Rome and its new Greek allies cannot win. Macedonia and Carthage may have a chance if Macedon were able to quickly subdue its lesser Greek rivals and follow up with a successful attack on Rome. We could suppose that, as was done with Macedonia, Hannibal reaches out to the Seleucids earlier than in our world, and proposes an alliance between the three powers, which could see Macedon and Carthage focus on Rome, while the Seleucids combat Roman allies within Greece, potentially claiming them as spoils of war. This might inflame tensions between Macedonia and the Seleucids in the following years, but Macedon might be convinced if it were awarded historically Greek lands in southern Italy. With that, I'll let my good friend Simon from the group Education take our scenario from here.
We were actually very close to achieving this in our timeline. In the Second Punic War, Rome was at war with Carthage, and Carthage's leading general, Hannibal, was devastating Rome's homeland. Hannibal went almost unchallenged against Rome, but was unable to receive any reinforcements from the rest of Carthage. Eventually, Rome outlasted him and he was forced to retreat. However, Hannibal had a backup plan. If Carthage couldn't reinforce him, then maybe someone else could. Macedonia. Macedonia was the great Greek powerhouse, the successor state to Alexander the Great's empire. Macedonia accepted Hannibal's proposal in our timeline, but was unable to truly support him as they were caught up in battles at home. But in an alternate timeline, what would happen if Macedonia succeeded in sending troops to Hannibal? Well, Hannibal had more allies than just Macedonia. After Hannibal's defeat in our timeline, he left Carthage and became an advisor to the Seleucid Empire. It was actually Hannibal's appointment to the position that led Rome to invade the Seleucids in a later war. So Hannibal stands as the unifier of Carthage, Macedonia, and the Seleucids. If Hannibal could send all three empires against Rome, he would be unstoppable. Macedonia would reach Italy fairly quickly, attacking in the east and the south, and drawing forces away from Hannibal further north. The Seleucids would clean up Rome's allies elsewhere in the Mediterranean and free up Carthaginian and Macedonian forces to move further into Italy. Hannibal is reinforced and his conquest continues. While Rome had excellent strategy, the sheer weight of the Mediterranean would be too much for it and the city would fall. Carthage would receive most of the Italian peninsula and the West Mediterranean islands, while Macedonia would take the southernmost part of Italy along with Rome's Balkan territory. The Seleucids would take over the various Greek city-states that had allied with Rome. These territorial acquisitions would create conflict, as Macedonia wanted to be the sole Greek power, thus bringing them into conflict with the Seleucids, and Carthage wanted to be the sole Italian power, thus bringing them into conflict with Macedonia. Hannibal, the arbitrator of the alliance, would most likely prevent the conflicts, but rivalries between the powers would start to develop. In our timeline, after the Punic Wars ended, Macedonia and the Seleucids entered into an agreement to take over Egypt. They succeeded in installing a puppet ruler and expanding into Egypt's territory, but this sudden power grab is what prompted Rome to retaliate against Macedonia to prevent it from becoming too powerful. Without Rome, Macedonia and the Seleucids expand uninhibited, and we would most likely see Carthage expanding its borders as well. While another war would briefly unite the alliance once more, conflicting Egyptian claims would increase overall tensions. Hannibal would eventually die, and the alliance with him. Without Hannibal in Italy to protect Macedonia, the Seleucids leap on the chance to expand. In our timeline, after Rome attacked Macedonia for invading Egypt, Macedonia was weak and was then invaded by the Seleucids. Rome, again, was upset and moved on the Seleucids, defeating them as well. Now, the Seleucids make a similar move, attacking Macedonia from its positions in Greece. Macedonia would generally be losing, but it was far from defeated. Carthage would see the Seleucid Empire as a dominant threat, and send its resources to help Macedonia. At the same time, Carthage would fully fund an Egyptian uprising to stand up against Seleucid control. Eventually, the Seleucid Empire would fall into internal collapse for separate reasons. This happened in our timeline as the Seleucids had long been on the decline, only briefly seeing a resurgence around the time of the Roman Wars. This resurgence would end, and the Seleucids would fall apart. Macedonia takes back what it lost, and expands further into Seleucid territory. Carthage invades the Seleucid coast, and Egypt moves into the Levant. The Seleucids are left alive, but only as a rump state in the northern Levant. This happened in our timeline too, as it provided a good buffer state for the Near East empires. The Parthians, a force from Central Asia, would clean up the Seleucids' eastern lands. With the Seleucids gone, Macedonia and Carthage would reach an uneasy alliance. They both had large empires to maintain and not much reason to fight each other. Carthage would spend its time developing Egypt in order to build an effective ally in the Near East. It would then expand its influence into Western Europe, reinforcing Italy and Iberia and trading with the Celts. Greece would expand north too, exploring the Black Sea and possibly being the one to develop trade with East Asia. The two empires would live in relative stability for the time being. However, just like how Rome, as great as it was, collapsed, so too with Carthage and Macedonia. German invaders would sweep through Europe and take over Carthaginian territory, while the Slavs would hit Greece from the north. The two empires would finally be over. So what happens next? Well, Rome's known for its centralization. It developed regions, established infrastructure, stable government, and gave Europe a unified culture. Not Carthage. Carthage wanted influence and trade. Military expansion was secondary, and centralization was irrelevant. As long as the territory was subservient, little effort was made to make the territory Carthaginian. The native tribes would certainly benefit from Carthage, expanding trade routes and spreading information, but unlike Spain and France, which in our timeline would become Latinized, they would retain their native culture and society. It is possible that the Carthaginian language would unify them to some extent, but nowhere near to the degree of Latin. The end-all change would be religion. Simply put, it was Rome that popularized Christianity, not simply because the emperors would adopt the religion, but also because of Latin, roads, and free travel that allowed the religion to spread as it did. Not only would Rome not exist to crucify Jesus, but even if Jesus still dies and still inspires a following, their ability to convert would be limited. At the time, religion was more of a cultural thing than theological. Greek gods coexisted with Egyptian ones, and it was not about who you believed, but who you worshipped. The Abrahamic God would be seen as just that, Abrahamic, the God of the people of Israel, not Greece, not Carthage, and not Egypt. That being said, monotheism would still develop. It just wouldn't be through Judaism or Christianity. The likely result would be an independent monotheistic religion. In Egypt, society was divided between a Greek upper class installed by Alexander the Great and an Egyptian populace who were native. As a result, the Greek rulers went to a lot of effort to unite the Greeks and Egyptians. To do this, they invented Serapis, a god meant to be both Egyptian and Greek, and was the amalgamation of higher-tier gods from both cultures. It is very likely that Egypt turned Serapis into a monotheistic god in order to unite the country. Assuming Christianity is even founded at all without Rome, Islam would develop soon after. Arabia was cut off from the West and developed separately. The Caliphate rises and becomes the new power in the Near East. In our timeline, the Caliphate expanded into the weaker regions of fallen Rome. In this timeline, the Near East would develop its own strong powers, notably Egypt. Battle-hardened against its neighbors and heavily developed by Carthage, Egypt would be able to stand up against the Caliphate. This would not lead in the Caliphate's defeat. Rather, it would simply be redirected towards the Parthians and invade towards India and East Asia. In the end, we would see a vaguely Carthaginian Western Europe, cooperating in trade but divided culturally and politically. Eastern Europe and the Near East would be a semi-Greek collective of empires worshipping the same god and working against Islam. Further east would be Islam, dominating international trade and being the center of intellect. How these regions would compete, how they would develop, and how they would interact with East Asia, Africa, and the Americas are an unknown. So here is where we'll leave the scenario. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Also, support our ally across the continent by checking out the group education. Mr. Z and Simon, out.